Good evening. It's a pleasure to be moderating this discussion on Maiolica at the Bargello this evening. Right away, I want to thank, before continuing, I want to thank London Art Week for providing this platform to the Bargello, to the Friends of the Bargello, and to the art world in London. They've been hugely effective in a particularly difficult year. So thank you. My name is Katherine Zock, and I'm speaking to you tonight in my capacity as Vice President and Director of the Friends of the Bargello, which is a non-for-profit group dedicated to the support and raising the awareness of the world's most important collection of Italian sculpture, but as we'll be learning tonight, one of the most important collections of decorative arts, including Maiolica. Thank you. Thank you. The title of our talk tonight is The Development of Maiolica, the Maiolica collection in the Bargello from the Medici to the present day. And we have, as you know, a fantastic panel to discuss this subject. But the premise of this wonderful conversation this evening is the publication of an upcoming catalog on the Maiolica collection in the Bargello by its curator, Marino Marini. A previous publication has not occurred since 1971. And since that time, the collection has grown immensely. I seem to recall that Marino mentioned it was almost doubled since 1971. So it's a long-awaited and very important publication, which the Friends of the Bargello are incredibly proud to have been instrumental in providing the funding for it, which has come from a well-known collector, connoisseur, and dealer, Alain Moatti, who is underwriting the entire project, including the assistant researcher that Marino is required to have for the extensive work that's being done, and through to the publication itself. It's well underway. In fact, it's at least a third finished at the moment. And it's on this occasion that London Art Week has extended this platform so that we can discuss Maiolica predominantly from the Bargello, but the ways in which the Medici influenced its development and the dissemination of Maiolica really throughout Europe and the world. Let's see, could we have the next slide, Pauline, which just shows the Bargello. The magnificent building itself is the oldest in Florence. And the core of the collection, as most people know, is Medici, which obviously adds a wonderful importance to the collection and also a real unique nature to its collection. And the collection has, of course, the core collection of the Maiolica, in fact, is also Medici. Very important in that Medici porcelain is so rare, and it's wonderful to have a large proportion of those pieces that remain within the Bargello. The dissemination of Medici porcelain from Florence is something that some of the panelists will be discussing this evening, and it occurred during the sort of 18th and 19th centuries. This dissemination, the production of Maiolica itself was, of course, brought to Italy from other countries too, and it was the Medici's focus on this production, which made it most prevalent in Italy. I'd like to, let's see, the next slide, please, Pauline, shows a group of three splendid pieces in the Bargello. that Marino Marini has selected for specific emphasis in this discussion. And they'll be used throughout the evening as a sort of touchstone for the panelists to refer to. They will, of course, be elaborating on these three pieces, but equally they'll be bringing in other works within either their own museum collections or their own experiences that relate. And there are a few themes which will be running through the conversation, but they will, be bouncing off these three incredible works of the Bargello. The next slide, Pauline. This is an unbelievably rare, I presume unique, plaque of Francesco De Medici. And it will again later probably be referred to by certainly Justin. But it emphasizes the importance of Francesco on the development of what we now call Medici porcelain, which was the earliest development of soft paste porcelain in Europe. And it was following the death of Francesco de Medici, which it appears to in 1587, thank you, that it's possible that this production even ended, though that's something which Justin will be discussing more as well as we go on. I'd like to introduce the three panelists this evening, which you've all come to hear very enthusiastically, as three of as curators, scholars, connoisseurs, and dealers, they encompass a wonderful three-pronged approach to this subject matter, and probably between them cover every aspect of knowledge known in this area. I'll start first with Timothy Wilson, who many of you know as was the keeper of Western art at the Ashmolean from 1990 to 2017. And from 2010, he was professor of the arts of the Renaissance at the University of Oxford. He's the Emeritus Fellow of the Balliol College in Oxford, and he's currently preparing, and this is exciting, COVID permitting, of course, but he's currently preparing an exhibition on Italian Maiolica at the Museum of Applied Arts in Vienna, which is scheduled for the spring of 2022. Alan Phipps Darr is the senior curator of the European Art Department in Walter B. Ford II Family Curator of European Sculpture and Decorative Arts at the Detroit Institute of Art. And he's contributed significantly to the European Arts Department at the DIA through exhibitions, publications, and reinstallations since he began at the museum in 1981. Justin Raccanello is a dealer with a widely recognized and deeply respected authority on Italian Maiolica. Leading this area of the art market, Justin is a regular exhibitor at TFAF, Frieze Masters, and London Art Week. His maneuverability between the commercial and scholarly aspects of this subject ensure that he'll add great depth to this panel. It's a very great pleasure to hand the discussion over to our panel, and following, I will monitor questions as they come in, and we'll make sure that we have a amount of time towards the end to address them. Certainly, if I'm unable to address all the questions, please feel free to email me directly, and it would be a pleasure to get the answers for you and return them. So thank you very much. I think it's Justin. Shall we start with you on the first slide?
Katherine, may I interrupt? Am I right in thinking that you should emphasize that questions should go on the Q&A, not on the chat page? Is that right?
Yes, I think, yes, thank you. I think that happens. I think that happens automatically, but thank you. Yes, in the Q&A section of the Zoom facility. Thank you, Tim.
Shall we go to the next slide?
Yes, that would be great. Justin, thank you for starting.
Thank you very much, Katherine, for that great introduction. And thank you to, well, I won't thank them yet because they haven't spoken, so we'll do that at the end. But hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us here. We're going to give you a brief overview of the collection of Maiolica in the Bargello, and included in that, I believe, should be the collection of Medici porcelain, or we're going to talk about Medici porcelain because it is so intimately linked with the history of Maiolica in that period. So we can give you a brief idea of what was going on in Florence at the time. Now, the nucleus of pieces in the Bargello, when it was first founded as a National Museum of Decorative Arts in Italy in 1865, it was very much seen as a museum of medieval art, but there was obviously a nucleus of pieces that had survived from the time of the Medici. And among those were just over 50 pieces of Maiolica, which formed the basis of the collection of Maiolica in the museum today. I wanted, or in fact, Marino, who unfortunately can't be with us, Marino Marini, the curator of ceramics in the Bargello, wanted to show us this particular image because this is probably the best illustration of what the Medici were commissioning in the late 16th century in Florence from Urbino potters. And Cosimo de' Medici dies in 1574, and he has Chinese porcelain, he has Islamic pottery, but he doesn't have, it appears, any Urbino pottery himself. But his sons, Francesco and Ferdinando, were commissioning Maiolica from the Fontana workshop in Urbino. And there is a letter dated 1573, which mentions two vases, of which this is one, each with two handles decorated with eagles and masks and painted with grotesques. Now, this piece was presumably sent to Cardinal Ferdinando, as he was before his brother died and he became the Grand Duke, when he was Cardinal in Rome in 1573, and is a wonderful illustration of the grotesque decoration that was popular at this time, and it reflects what you would have found on the ceiling, for instance, of the Palazzo Vecchio, in the grotesque decoration on white ground that was painted and designed by Giorgio Vasari in the 1550s. You saw three other pieces just in the previous images, which were all also part of the nucleus of pieces that have definitely descended from the Medici collections. This piece, yes, that's just about all I wanted to say about this. Tim, you have a piece that you want to show us. Can we have the next slide, please?
Thank you, Justin.
Yeah.
Evening all. This is one of three tri-lobed wine coolers, what in the Renaissance are called rinfrescatori, which are still in the Bargello, which can almost certainly be correlated with four such wine coolers mentioned in an inventory of the Medici collections in 1588. So after Cosimo's time, but early in collecting. They are part of a series of subjects from the Punic Wars, the battles between Hannibal and the Romans, of which at least 40 something survive, and of which, as I'll say, about probably 120 were made. I have maintained that this is about the most serious and systematic treatment of classical history over 120 odd episodes in any medium in Renaissance art. It was made in the workshop of the Fontana family, probably under the direction of Orazio Fontana's father, Guido Durantino, and probably in the 1550s. It falls into three parts. There are 20-something plates, all of which have a mysterious shadow in the sky, where a coat, which was space left for a coat of arms that was never filled in. So this was a commission which is intended as an armorial commission that never came about. Then all the rest are numbered, starting with one of the Bargello systems dated dated 41, numbered. Start again, Tim. Numbered 41. And then after that, there are plates which are individually numbered up to nearly 120. So it was a vast service, the sort of thing which can really only have been commissioned by the ducal family, very probably Guidobaldo II, Duke of Urbino, from 1538 to 1574 himself. Now, we don't know who this set was commissioned for, but it may never have reached them. And by 1588, as I say, these three pieces and probably the whole of the rest of the set were in Medici possession. Then an odd thing happened, and this is the first chapter in the sad story of the dispersal of much of the Medici collections. And this is a letter quite recently discovered in Swiss archives and published from a visitor to Locarno in Italian-speaking Switzerland. And I'm going to read this, and it's dated 1735. At Locarno, I was shown a cupboard full of Maiolica pottery with the history of Hannibal, for which the owners, the Orelli brothers, were offered a price equal to the best silver, though the sequence of stories is not complete and some pieces are missing. This pottery belonged to a Grand Duke of Florence, whose palace caught fire. A man from Locarno, or more accurately from Centovalli, rescued the pottery for himself, great use of the word rescue, and then brought it home. At that time, the father of these brothers was magistrate in Centovalli, and the pottery was offered to him for purchase. He wrote to the Grand Duke of Florence and received the reply that if the history was still complete, it should be sent back to him, but if some pieces were already broken, they could keep it. It thus remained Locarno, and so the bulk of the plates from the Hannibal service were removed under questionable circumstances as a result of a fire from Florence at some point before 1735. And this is the first episode I know of the dispersal of the Medici collections. There's an inventory in the 1780s in which some plates, which obviously didn't go off to Switzerland, are also mentioned, and they seem to have been included in the next regrettable episode, which was a mass disposal by a Grand Duke, not obviously interested in Maiolica, in 1797, the moment at which Maiolica was probably most out of favor with collectors and connoisseurs. And some 200 pieces were bought by a Florentine curiosity dealer called Campolini and were dispersed from them. These included some of the very greatest masterpieces of Maiolica in existence, including the famous plate that's now in the V&A, showing a painter painting a Maiolica piece in front of two fashionable clients. So it is a story of a series of dispersals, but what remains remains the most spectacular group of high Renaissance Maiolica of its sort, and with this wonderful provenance right back to the Medici family's commissions from the 1570s onwards.
Tim, what is it? What do you think about the anecdotal evidence about Andrew Fountain being given Maiolica by Cosimo III in 1714-15?
Well, for those who don't know, the Fountain collection was at Narford Hall in the deep Norfolk countryside and was formed by Sir Andrew Fountain, diplomat and connoisseur in the early years of the 18th century, and remained at Narford until it was sold in 1884. And that included a number of grand, grotesque painted and historiato pieces of the same type as the Bargello. And through the 19th and early 20th century, there was a strong tradition that these had been given to Sir Andrew Fountain by the Grand Duke when he was visiting Florence. I am skeptical about this because what we do know is that Andrew Fountain acquired a great deal of his collection, including grotesque painted Maiolica, in Paris. And my guess is that while I don't know that it's not true, there is no evidence in Florentine archives for any such gift from the Grand Duke to Andrew Fountain. And I suspect that most of the high Renaissance pieces in the Fountain collection actually came from Paris, not from Florence. While we're debunking myths, if you look in the handy little but very slight inventory catalogue of 1971 of the Bargello Maiolica by Giovanni Conti, this is described as the Servito di Guidobaldo, and this reflects another long-standing myth that a lot of the Historiato in the Bargello was a service made for Guidobaldo della Rovere, Duke of Urbino, and which, when the della Rovere duchy passed into papal hands after 1631, it was always thought that the Maiolica was brought by Vittoria della Rovere, heir to the art collections of the della Rovere, to Florence when she married a Grand Duke. There is no, again, documentary evidence that Vittoria della Rovere bought any of Maiolica, and the extensive documentary researches, particularly of Marco Spallanzani, have shown that these, for instance, are identifiable already in Florence in an inventory of 1588, and that the whole business of a Guidobaldo service is an unsubstantiated myth.
Shall we move on to a nice early piece that was made for the Medici, even earlier than when we were talking about? Thank you, Pauline. Alan, I think you want to tell us about this.
Well, yes, and in conjunction with the discussion of the early Medici collection, we're jumping back now 100 years or more to this wonderful two-handled vase that was as the coat of arms of the Medici and the Orsini. And we believe that it was made for either for the wedding or in celebration of the marriage of Lorenzo the Magnificent, whose arms are on the left-hand side, and Clerici Orsini, his bride, when they were married in 1469, possibly later. It was made most likely in Montelupo, which is just 12 kilometers southwest of Florence. And you will see it looks a little Hispano-Moresque, because up until about this time, maybe a little bit earlier, there was a great importation of Hispano-Moresque ceramics to Italy and to Florence in particular to decorate the households. And then the Italians, the Tuscans, decided they wanted to make their own ceramics, which we call Maiolica, somewhat after Majorca. It features this little flower called the Bryony plant, or Bryony flower, that you find often on Hispano-Moresque ceramics of the 15th century. And in fact, this is at our museum, the Detroit Institute of Arts. It has been cataloged by Tim Wilson and I, and developed a catalog in 2013 of the Italian Renaissance and later ceramics. And this is online, by the way. It's in our Detroit Institute of Arts bulletin for 2013. And Tim has referred to this as one of the two most historically important early Italian Maiolicas, because not only is it have the coat of arms, meaning it was in the Medici collection, but there is an inventory at Poggio a Caiano in 1494, where it is documented as being described carefully with the coat of arms of the Medici and the Orsini, and in the just off the kitchen in a room at Poggio a Caiano, which is one of the Medici villas where there's great frescoes by Pontormo. We were encouraged to talk about how the Bargello inspired us, and in particularly its ceramics collections. And I'm pleased to say I've been researching and studying in Florence and going to the Bargello since the late 60s, even early 70s, and have known all of the previous directors. This is one of the pieces that got away, probably in the late 18th century, when the Medici ceramics were sold at auction at Palazzo Vecchio in 1772. We don't have that documentation precisely, but it appeared in the 1930s, and we at the Detroit had an outpost where we featured just Renaissance works of art in a lovely Renaissance-inspired villa on the shores of a lake, St. Clair, near us. And this was acquired by the museum by William Valentiner. And Valentiner deserves mentioning because he was our first, the curator, starting in 1921, then the director, 1924 until 1945. And it was Valentina who, working with the architect Paul Cray, used the Bargello as the great influence, the source of the architecture. We have an interior courtyard with a stairway that, and Valentina acquired many, mostly Tuscan, but other Italian 14th, 15th, and 16th century coats of arms that are embedded into the walls of our courtyard, directly inspired by the Bargello. Valentina also wrote a lot about the importance, looking at ceramics, particularly early Italian Maiolica, and being inspired by Boda, his mentor, Wilhelm von Boda. He wrote about the importance of studying early or decorative arts of different periods, and particularly ceramics, in addition to painting and sculpture and architecture, because it was the decorative arts that give the visitor to the museum a true sense of what were the stylistic and artistic developments in a culture taking over time. And he published this early on, even in the 19-teens, in the 1920s. And for our museum, he acquired what is one of the maybe top 5 collections of Italian ceramics in America. We'll talk more about that later, but I just wanted to give you a sense of the importance of this piece. It's documented, it's a very early piece, and the Bargello contains, we've been talking more about the Storiato and the later 16th century pieces, but they also have a very fine collection of the early Renaissance Maiolica that will be published in the catalog.
Yeah.
Maybe Tim would like to add something more about there's a related piece in the British Museum that Tim and Dora Thornton published in their splendid 2-volume catalog, and has been featured prominently as being historically important as well.
Yeah, I find this an extraordinarily emotive object. The decoration, as Alan says, is derived from the Hispano-Moresque imports made by Muslim craftsmen, particularly at Manises outside Valencia, which the Italians wrongly called Maiolica, but both the decoration and the wing-handled form are essentially of Hispano-Moresque origin. I take issue a little bit with Alan about the date. I would love it to have been made for the marriage, but the archaeological record in Montelupo does seem to indicate that this kind of decoration only comes into use in Montelupo about 1480. On the other hand, there are technical imperfections about this, which means that it could perfectly well be an early experimental piece. So I think that whether you call it 1469 or whether you call it 1475 to 1480, we don't really have the evidence for that. Lots of things were made at the time of marriages, but lots of things were also made for married couples later. The Hispano-Moresque imports, of course, were lustered, and that was glamorous and expensive. At Montelupo at the time, the potter who made this didn't know how to make luster, so has imitated it with a sort of pale brown strokes. But nonetheless, this seems to me to mark the sort of coming of age of Italian Maiolica more than any other object, in that, the most discriminating and glamorous patrons of the age are having things made for them, not but expensive imports, but for the first time, native Italian wares that are capturing the top of their own market. So it's the precursor to a century in which Italian Maiolica potters essentially ruled Europe.
Yeah, and I wanted to say one of the reasons why pieces with the Medici coat of arms from this period are so incredibly rare. If you've been watching your TV program of the Medici, you'll know that their great enemies were the Pazzi. And after the expulsion of the Medici at the end of the 15th century, there's a declaration, I think it's from 1508, when one of the Pazzi orders all of the ceramics with coats of arms of the Medici to be destroyed so that people will forget that they were ever in power. So having a piece like this is incredibly rare and something to be certainly appreciated. Can we move to the next slide, please? For those of you who've been waiting for us to talk about porcelain, we've got something extremely exciting here. This dish from the Medici porcelain factory dating to sometime between 1574 and 1587, although it's possible that the factory may have carried on later in Florence, but in a different place, shows you how incredibly accomplished they were at this period to have discovered a means of making this mysterious and translucent and magical material. You see a beautiful painting in the middle based on a design, it's St. Mark the Evangelist, based on a design by George Pence. But if you look on the screen, you can see that it wasn't part of the Grand Ducal collections. I don't think any piece of Medici porcelain did survive the dispersion in the 18th century. And this was actually bought by Alessandro Castellani, who was the well-known jeweler and also a great collector of pieces, which I would like to ask Tim to talk about a little, because he really has studied this to a much greater degree than me. Tim?
Castellani was an extraordinary many-sided genius. The main family business was jewelry in the classical style, but he was a marchand amateur of the finest knowledge. And a key moment in the history of the diffusion of Maiolica around the world was 1876 at the Philadelphia Centennial, when the Castellani exhibition collection was, or one of Castellani's successive collections was exhibited, and both Boston and more intensively the Met made an attempt to buy the Castellani collection. But I think perhaps they weren't used enough to dealing with Italians, because Castellani named a price and the Met went off to its benefactors and said, this is the price. And the response came back that it was too expensive. I suspect that Castellani had expected to be offered half his asking price, and in that case that would have happened. But it was too early really for American taste, which was still focused on salon paintings and Chinese porcelain. And there was no significant Maiolica collecting at the time, really until Pierpont Morgan comes on the scene some 20 or 30 years later. Then Castellani dies, and in 1884, this gets put up for sale. And in one of the early triumphs, really, of the Italian notifica legislation, its sale is blocked by the Italian state, and it stays with the Castellani heirs, and they give it to the Bargello, still quite a new museum then, 5 years later. And it's worth saying that the story of Medici porcelain was effectively forgotten from the 17th century to the mid-19th century, when a fascinating and dodgy character called Alessandro Foresi wrote a book on Medici porcelain published in 1859. And at that point, it became a huge cult with collectors over Europe, as is indicated by the fact, perhaps, that the Bargello has 4 pieces. There are 4, I think, others in Italy, and there are 17 in Paris. But this is a glorious thing, very unusual for Medici porcelain in its choice of subject matter from a German engraving. And it so happens that rather surprisingly, it must have been a set of 4 evangelists, and 2 others of the 4 that must have been survive. One in Arezzo and one in Lisbon.
Tim, I'd just like to pick you up on one thing there. I refute completely the suggestion that Italian antique dealers ask double what they're expecting to get. But apart from that, yes, it's a brilliant history of the piece. And an interesting history of the early years of the Bargello is that it was used as a deposito, as a storeroom. It was the whole idea of the Bargello. It was that it was based on the Musée de Cluny in Paris and the South Kensington Museum, which became then the Victoria and Albert Museum. But because of the situation of Florence, initially becoming capital of Italy in 1870, and somewhere that people were coming, it was their first stop in Italy when collectors from other countries were coming to buy antiques. They were stopping off in Florence. So there was a toing and froing in the Bargello where collectors, Italian collectors, would deposit their goods. And so what happened with this piece is that it was deposited in the Bargello in 1880, and it was proposed for sale from there, and you could do this at the time. And it wasn't until the Italian state put the block on it and didn't allow it to go that the Castellani family decided to give it to the Bargello. So it's an interesting history. But I think Alan has a lot to tell us about Medici porcelain, with in particular the most amazing piece that he has. Pauline, can we go to the next slide, please?
Thank you. It is a fascinating story, and most of my first part of my career, I always dreamt of the possibility of finding a great Medici porcelain work of art like the bowl we just saw. And looking at the Bargello and looking at their collection, looking at the Louvre's collection, which is remarkable. I was first able to find an extraordinary group of Doccia porcelain sculpture made in Florence in the what's called the golden years in 1745 to 1760. And Justin has a wonderful piece just behind him that he's showing, I think, in the London Art Week Fair. We have 23 pieces that I was able to recommend and acquire in 1990. And a decade later, much to my great surprise, I was offered this extraordinary Grand Ducal Medici porcelain ewer that has on front and the back the coat of arms of Francesco de Medici and his then wife Giovanna of Austria. Medici porcelain was just invented through Bernardo Buontalenti and Francesco de Medici working in their laboratory. You'll see an image, I think, next. But we know that, unfortunately, Giovanna of Austria dies in childbirth in 1578. So we can very precisely date this ewer to the period between 1574, when they were married, and when Medici porcelain first was invented, discovered. They've been trying to find the secret of creating Chinese hard paste porcelain. They didn't find the secret of hard paste porcelain, namely kaolin, but they did find the ingredients that could create this beautiful, translucent, soft paste porcelain. Our piece is essentially unique. It's one of the largest, the most historically significant, and one of the most aesthetically beautiful pieces of Medici porcelain known to survive of the some 60 known pieces. It has on the handles, just by the handles, it has the two grotesque figures that are very much inspired by Michelangelo. Buontalenti, Bernardo Buontalenti, was a superintendent of all the Medici workshops, and he most likely designed this work. It is also very rare, and there's only 4 or 5 pieces that have this beautiful grotesque decoration. The groteschi were rediscovered in the late 15 teens and then the 20s by Raphael in his workshop, painting in the Vatican Loggia. And this type of decoration inspired the painting on our ewer. There are a few other pieces, 2 in the Met in a private collection now, and a couple in Paris. But our piece, I published this, and I believe there's documented. Marco Spallanzani has done a remarkable inventory and publishing the inventories about the Medici ceramics and the Bargello. This was painted by Flaminio Fontana, and you may remember you saw his name associated with the 2-handled ewer that he gave to Cardinal Ferdinando de Medici in 1573. He was only active in Florence between 1573 and 1578. The piece we have here is published in the inventories of the Medici in 1691 and 1721, and we have documentation that it was sold at Palazzo Vecchio in 1772. We're not sure where it went, but we know that by 1859, it is published by the same Alessandro Foresi that Tim mentioned in an article in the One Hand Gazzetta Beaux-Arts and in the book as being the largest, the most historically important, and the greatest aesthetically beautiful piece of Medici porcelain. And it was then in the collection of Gustave de Rothschild. It remained in the Rothschild collection in Paris until we were fortunate to acquire it from them through an intermediary, Adrian Sassoon, in the year 2000. And it became one of the focal points of a great show that I organized on the Medici and the influence of Michelangelo that was held in Florence and Detroit and Chicago in 2003 and 2004. So there's much more that could be said about this. We're very fortunate to have it. It was a dream come true, and it definitely has a Medici inventory and provenance, and it's beautifully painted. And people have made pilgrimages to Detroit just to kneel down and admire it. So please come visit us when we can. travel again. We'd be delighted to have some of the people watching.
Alan, thank you for that. Before we move on, which we do need to do in the interest of time, but there's a question that relates specifically to this, and I'd like to ask it before we move on. A person attending the seminar has asked, could you elaborate on the extent and the value of information found on the back of, for example, this piece?
You mean, I think you mean underneath. Yes, I meant to say that. I apologize. So you will see the Medici Palais or balls, the 6 Medici Palais, that in the center, it's basically in Latin, but it's FMMED, the number 2, standing for Francescus Medicis Magnus Etruria Dux Secundus, or Francesco, the Medici Grand Duke of Tuscany, the second Grand Duke. And so that is what is that's very unusual. I think there's only one other piece that has this type of the initials indicating it was made for Francesco de Medici. Most of the time underneath Medici porcelain, you will find the company, the dome of Florence, of the Florence Cathedral, is generally the symbol indicating Medici porcelain, but there are a few anomalies, and this is one of them, and I think it indicates it's so special. I would like to add something more. This Justin mentioned, I think earlier, the Medici had a great collection of Chinese hard paste porcelain, and so you see these lappets down below. These are very much inspired by Chinese porcelain decoration, and much of the majority of the Medici porcelain that survives today is very much inspired, the decoration's inspired in somewhat in imitation of Chinese porcelain. So this is quite rare, and having these wonderful, very sculptural masks, as well as this beautiful, fine, grotesque decoration, and it's a unique piece, and it's quite extraordinary.
Brilliant.
Can I add a couple of things to that? I mean, first of all, William Valentina, was a great, great curator, but he would have been so proud of his successor, Alan. This was absolutely, a great acquisition for Detroit in the spirit of Valentina. The mark at the bottom of many of the other pieces is the cupolone, the dome of Florence Cathedral, and an F. Here, the F, I've always been uncertain about whether that F stands for Firenze or for Francesco, but the fact there is an F in the middle of this suggests that the F on most pieces of marked Medici porcelain probably stands for Francesco rather than Firenze. I wonder if Alan and Justin agree.
I agree with that, Tim. I've been thinking about that, and I very much believe that it's Francesco was the one who invented it. Francesco was passionate about Medici porcelain, and so the cupola of the cathedral, the general symbol, but with the F, I think it's much more signifying Francesco as the inventor, as opposed to Florence. It could be both, but I think you're right.
And it's not only magnificent, it is also a very important early document, and ties up with a very nice letter, which the Ferrarese ambassador in Florence wrote in 1577, I think, how Francesco had shown him several large vessels of porcelain, which gave him much pleasure, because he'd not expected that this porcelain of his would succeed in large pieces. This was a particularly ironic and annoying thing to say to the ambassador from Ferrara, because in fact there is documentary evidence that earlier than Medici porcelain, there was successful production of porcelain in Ferrara under the Este Dukes of Ferrara. No piece of Ferrarese porcelain has ever been identified, and I suspect it remains one of the great discoveries perhaps still out there to be made, to find some of the porcelain made in Ferrara a few years before Medici porcelain.
Do you think the colored piece from Braunschweig and the other one in the BM could be those?
No, I've thought long and hard about that, and I believe the technical analysis is identical to Medici porcelain, and I think I did discuss that hypothesis in the British Museum catalogue some years ago, but I don't accept it.
Well, it depends where they got the clay from.
It's more, yeah, it's a complicated mixture of clays, of course, and firing temperatures come in. Separate discussion, Justin, but I don't think that's right.
Can we move to the next slide, please? So talking about whether the F underneath was for Florence or Francesco, I believe that it must have been Francesco. This is a painting by Jan van der Straat, known as Stradanos, which is in the Palazzo Vecchio, in the Studiolo of Francesco. And it's called the Alchemist Laboratory. And what you are looking at here is one of the richest men in Europe sitting. Francesco De Medici is the young man with the beard sitting in the bottom right of this painting. And you see one of the richest men in Italy sitting in what would be considered for the day a high-tech laboratory. In this period, alchemy, science didn't really exist, and alchemy was the closest you could get to it. And it involved doing a lot of experiments and a lot of distillation. And of course, this is what you have. You have someone trying to distill a material, looking for some kind of material. And what they did manage to discover was the way to make porcelain. And just imagine how much effort they put into that. And they succeeded where nobody else did for 100 years. So, you know, it's incredible to think how much research may have gone on in this laboratory. Now, this laboratory was Francesco's laboratory in the Palazzo Vecchio. In this period, this is dated 1570. Between 1569 and 1574, he had asked the architect Bontalenti that Alan mentioned to reform the Casino di San Marco so that he could move all of his workshops over there. And what he did was take everything over there. And that's when we believe he commenced making the Medici porcelain. And we believe that it finished in 1587 because we believe that possibly he was involved with it. I mean, if you go forward to 1737 and you think of Carlo Ginori, he was a chemist himself and he was instrumental in making the pastes and the glaze for the Ginori porcelain. So it's not beyond belief to think that actually Francesco was personally involved in making the Medici porcelain, because unlike his father and unlike his younger brother who was to succeed him, he spent most of his time when he was supposed to be running Tuscany as a state. He spent most of his time in his workshops and laboratories conducting experiments, and this is documented in various places. We could go on about this painting for a great deal, but I'd just like to mention one more thing, and this is the personality sitting behind Francesco, who has been identified as the alchemist Sisto di Bonsisti, who was employed by Cosimo de' Medici to make false gems, and also was employed in an alchemical research and pharmaceutical sense. Given that, I believe that the young man standing there holding the bottle, the flask, is his son, Niccolò Sisti, who was to go on to work for the Medici for 50 years, making glass, making Maiolica, and also making, is documented that in 1620, Cosimo II says that he was still capable in that period of making porcelain, even though we have no proof. Anyway, enough about this one because Catherine's looking at me badly. And
I might just say there's a lot of new information. We can't talk about it now. Some very exciting discoveries about Niccolò Sisti, but it's for another talk, another event.
It's
we'll
another
able to share this, not today.
Yeah, not today. But we're going to move on to the next slide, please. And this is one of Tim's favorite Maiolica painters, I believe.
Okay, before this is the rude bit of our session, I think. These are rather charmingly called accoppiamenti dei dei in the old catalogue. But before I come on to this, and I'm aware that time is doing its winged stuff behind us, I just want to enjoy myself by correcting Justin in one matter, in that I think it is entirely likely that the relief portrait of Francesco, which is in the Medici porcelain, is from the original Medici collections. It was given in, I think it was transferred, from the Uffizi in the 1880s, and had been found with various bits and pieces in a drawer in the Uffizi. So I think it's highly likely that that one piece of Medici porcelain had indeed remained in the Medici collections. This is by Francesco Durantino, who is one of the most interesting and well-documented of Renaissance painters. And he was trained in Urbino, and he later went and worked in Rome in a place called Nazzano, north of Rome, and for the the Duke of Savoy in Turin. But this is marked, one of three pieces in existence, marked as Monte Bagnolo, which is a little place outside Perugia. And it's a fascinating episode where he leaves Urbino and sets up by himself, and then goes bankrupt and is driven out of the papal state of Perugia and goes wandering and tends to leave debts behind him, but also becomes one of the great creative achievers of mid-16th century Historiato Maiolica. This is from the Grand Ducal collections. No idea how it got to the Bargello, but it is one of the key documents for, to me, one of the two or three most interesting Maiolica artists we know about.
It must have got there before 1736. It must have been there in the 16th century, do you think?
I think that's quite likely, but I don't know. Why 1737?
Because it would have been bought by the Medici. I don't think the Lorraine bought anything when they didn't buy any Maiolica for the collection.
That's right. Correct. I think it's more likely to have got there in the 16th century.
Okay. Should we move on to the next slide?
Well, I will take this because it's in our collection again. And as I mentioned, William Valentiner was greatly inspired by Italian Maiolica. He built a very good collection and was followed a bit by his successor, Edgar Richardson. Oddly enough, because of maybe the prices were high, but we as a museum did not acquire another piece of Maiolica until 50 years after the last piece in the 1960s. This was acquired in 2011. And it's by this subject that we're not talking about now is about Maiolica artists, Maiolica painters. And one of the greatest painters is Francesco Zanto Avelli de Rovigo. Rovigo is where he was from, outside of Padua, but he worked in Urbino all of his career, documented, I think, from 1530 to 1542, but he was probably active as early as 1525. There are pieces attributed to Zanto Avelli. There was a great exhibition by John Mallet, wonderful keeper at the V&A some years ago at the Wallace Collection, and a publication. This is an extraordinary piece that shows about the dream of Astyages. And Astyages was a king of Media, you see on the right, wearing the helmet. He dreamt that his daughter Mandana would give birth to a son, and the son would conquer all of Asia. So you see the vine growing over her, and in below is the young boy holding a helmet, who becomes Cyrus the Great, the ruler of all of Asia and the Near East. And in the background, you see Cyrus probably wearing the tunic, fighting with others, demonstrating his physical prowess and his intelligence. It is on the back. You will see it's Zanto often assigned his works. We do have other pieces by Zanto, but this was particularly wonderful because it's not only painted by Zanto Avelli, but it's lustered by a member of the Andreoli family, famous for its lustering, and most probably by Vincenzo Andreoli, because there is an N, I don't know if you can see it, it's just by the date of 1535. So he dated, he wrote the inscription of what the story is. It is a beautiful work, and it contains luster work, of which we were sort of thin on. So this, I must say, because I see my friend, the great scholar, dealer, Alan Mawati, is underwriting the Bargello catalog. This was a piece he had in his wonderful collection that he was willing to let go. I've also been, I think, another theme of the Bargello is building collectors and encouraging collectors to buy and give to the museums. And a good patron of our museum and a friend of mine, Richard and Joanne Brody, were generous in acquiring some pieces of Maiolica, and later they've donated in the next piece I will be showing you. I'm a little concerned with the time. Do we have time to look at the next piece?
Go on to the next one. Yeah, let's go on to the next one briefly.
This is, in terms of great Maiolica painters or artists, this is another, this is another piece I long wanted to have represented, a work by Niccolo da Urbino and an associate. Niccolo da Urbino he's been called the Raphael of Maiolica painting. His work somewhat are sometimes inspired by drawings or prints by Raphael. And Tim, I encouraged the Brodys to acquire this. They did in 2005, again from Mr. Mawati. And then they generously made this a promise gift to the museum, and then later a gift in 2015. It's on the back cover of the catalog I just showed you. And this is, Timothy argues very incorrectly that the Puto at the top right in the clouds are by the famous painter Niccolo da Urbino, and the rest of the work is by an associate who was in the workshop of Guido Durantino, with whom Niccolo worked. And Guido Durantino, we've looked at some of his works already, and the Bargello has very fine pieces by Durantino. Both of these pieces have very fine provenance and were in excellent condition, and we were very grateful to be able to frankly acquire these from Alan Mawati, and now they're highlighted in our own collection. But very much, every time I bought a piece of either the porcelain or the Maiolica, I look carefully at what is in the Bargello to see how it compares, and I felt good when that it was at least on a similar level to what was in the Bargello. So I encourage other collectors, members of the Friends of the Bargello, to think about acquiring ceramics, and maybe later in their bequest or sooner to consider donating to the Bargello if possible, or another institution of their choice.
It's interesting that you show Nicola. There is a Nicola in the Bargello which does come from the Grand Ducal collections. But Tim, correct me if I'm wrong, and can we go to the next slide? I don't think there were any Xanthos in the Bargello Grand Ducal collections until this piece. Am I wrong?
I believe that's right, Justin.
Okay, so this piece was donated, and this is where the Bargello, the history of the Bargello becomes extremely exciting for museums in Italy, because Tim will tell us all about the history of the great French collector Louis Carand, who upon his death bequested his entire collection of Maiolica, ivory, sculpture, and all manner of things to the Bargello, at the expense of the French state, who were greatly horrified, and there were various ramifications, which Tim will tell us about.
Okay, shall we, can we move on to?
Yeah.
Please, Paul.
So this
Here is Louis Carand.
Of Carand that was, this was given to me by Marino to show, simply because it was commissioned by the Bargello to thank him for his gift, and it is in the Bargello now. So we can go on to the next slide.
This is a very beautiful piece. It used to be called Faenza. I think I managed to show about 30 years ago that it belongs to a group, all of which are marked TB on the back, which are in fact very early examples of the great flowering of Historiato painting in Urbino. And this is, of course, the martyrdom of St. Sebastian, and art historians among our audience will immediately say that this has a striking resemblance to the work of Signorelli. And in fact, I think that's right, because one of Signorelli's associates and pupils was Girolamo Genga, who comes from Urbino, and becomes essentially the court designer to the Della Rovere Dukes. I mean, it is quite simply one of the most beautiful pieces of Maiolica painting in existence. I think it and its companion with the Resurrection, which is in the V&A. And it was given by Louis Carand. And the Carand collection, I mean, not only have we just seen, gives the Bargello its only work by Francesco Xanto Avelli, but it gives this small but unbelievably high quality group of early Historiato. In that sense, Carand's taste is like that of Gustave de Rothschild, who we've already heard something about. It is the ultimate refinement of the great Parisian connoisseurship tradition in which Maiolica played such a central part of the mid-19th century. And it is a tribute to that very, very great tradition of connoisseurship, expertise, love, combined with activity on the market which Caron exemplified and which is wonderfully exemplified these days by the prime benefactor of the Bargello project, Alain Moatti, who's already been mentioned.
I just wanted to say this is the last slide, so don't leave us until Tim has finished talking about it. Katherine.
Yes, there are some questions. There are some questions that have come in, and the majority are sort of technical questions. So we might just lean into that direction for a moment. Though I will start with one question that is not technical. Excuse me. That is more about the usage of, in particular, wine coolers. This person asks, why had wine to be cooled? Which is a very good question. And was it meant to be poured in glasses at all? Thank you. Question about the wine cooler, which was slide 7.
Is that for me?
Sure, yes, thank you.
I mean, wine in hot Italian weather was drunk as cold as possible, and there are already ice houses in 16th century Italian villas. I have long been puzzled about to what extent these are used for mixing wine and water, because it was, again, as in ancient times, wine was sometimes drunk, diluted, or whether it's for bottles. But there is a very nice fresco by Giulio Romano in the Palazzo Te in Mantua, which shows a silver equivalent of these great wine coolers with bottles stacked up in it, no doubt with ice around them. So I think this is not, I mean, it's multi-purpose. You clearly can use it as a mixing bowl, but I think its prime purpose and what reflects the trilobed space, trilobed shape, is that you stack bottles in it among ice. I have spent 30 years looking for a surviving silver example of this, because these Maiolica forms were very often based on more expensive silver prototypes, but I've never found one.
If you think about wine bottles of the time, they were blown glass and they will have looked like a light bulb in shape. They wouldn't have had a flat bottom necessarily. And if you think about your traditional bottle of Chianti that has the straw bottom around it, that actually on a traditional bottle of Chianti will have been to make the base. The base will not have been in molded glass. So they will have sat very nicely in these wine coolers. So that's another possibility.
And I think then they were poured into small glasses, could have been even something ceramic or pewter, but certainly they were, yes, they had smaller glasses and smaller bottles, but keeping things cool in very hot Italian summers was, people did whatever they could do.
They still drink wine out of the fridge, red wine straight out of the fridge, so it's still cooled, but in a different way.
Italians still do sometimes drink red wine out of the fridge, don't they?
That's what I said.
Frowned on in England, but yeah.
And they mix water with the red wine as well.
So, my grandfather let me drink Coke with the red wine, but let's not go into that. Katherine.
A question specifically to Zanta Avelli plate, where this viewer was wondering how the colors could be achieved quite as brightly as they are, and they are magnificent. And I think that question came in specifically with slide 14, I think, or 15, but it's a great question. The colors are magnificent.
They were first done with a tin glazed enamel and fired once, and then they were fired. Then the glazes of the luster were put on, and they were fired at a lower temperature. But that, I think, helps. There's a red luster and a gold or ochre luster. There may even be a white or silver luster. That was debatable with our research scientists and our conservator. I think initially we thought there were 3 lusters, and maybe just 2, but nevertheless, it's quite rare to find a plate that has a few different colored lusters. And that is what attracted me very much to it. And it, in addition to being very beautifully painted, and it's quite brilliant, as you say. Tim may wish to add more about the technique.
And the main colors, the high temperature colors that are fused into the the white glaze are blue from cobalt, green from copper, yellow and orange from antimony and iron, and sort of purples and browns from manganese. And what is rather special about this is that this rather lovely turquoise on her frock, which is a very particular speciality of Xanthos. I mean, I think it's fairly describable as Mannerist, because he makes these colors, which are presumably a mixture of dilute cobalt and copper green. And sometimes they sort of shimmer. It's always difficult to show in a still photograph, but they have a sort of shot silk shimmer to them, which is a unique Xantho characteristic and achievement.
I mean, if you think back to Michelangelo's Sistine ceiling paintings and the color changeant, or the shock colors that are now prevalent, and also other Pontormo and Rosso, the colors are using very much is picked up in this type of painting by Xantho.
Yeah, remember that these are fired on. They can't change over time. They can't fade in sunlight. So this is the color that it was the day it was made, and it's never changed in color. So this is the color of all old master paintings from Renaissance period, rather than old master paintings being dark and this being particularly bright. You have to think of it in those terms.
And I think that makes it all the more exciting.
I remember 30 or 40 years ago, it must be now, when they started restoring the Sistine ceiling, and there was an enormous row, and it was claimed that the conservators had over-cleaned the Sistine ceiling because suddenly these very positively loud and brash colors came out, and Maiolica people like me rather sat on our bottoms with smug smiles, said, "We always told you Renaissance colors were like this."
Next question.
I have a specific question from John Mallet directed at you, Justin. Have you forgotten the porcelain bowls in the V&A dated 1627, 1628?
No, I haven't, but you know, we know very little about them. I did talk about those in a talk I gave on Italian porcelain earlier this year. What we do know is that Niccolò Sisti died in 1633. So he was still alive when the first bowl was made, which I believe is 1628 or 1627. So I wonder if he didn't give the secret to someone. I know that it's marked P, and we don't know if that P is for Pisa, if that P is for Padova, or if that P is for something else. But no, I haven't forgotten about them, John, don't worry. And I'd love to come back to that.
Well, thank you. I think we have a lot of material to have another conversation like this on Maiolica. I think we've really just begun to touch into many of these subjects, and the time went so fast. I felt we needed to speed through some of these. I would have loved to have heard more from all of you on every one of these slides, including the alchemy, which I think is fascinating because of my bronze background. It's certainly a subject in Renaissance Florence, which was compelling at the time. But we are already quite beyond the time that we've been permitted.
May I have 40 seconds?
Please, you can have as long as you want, as long as you want.
I mean, what we haven't really, I think, stressed enough is how extraordinarily special the Bargello collection is in its area of great strength. Of the Fontana type Maiolicas of the late 16th century. There's no collection in the world like it. And thanks to Katherine and subsequent donations, it's on its way to becoming comprehensive like the great collections of the world. It is blessed with an extraordinary curator in Marino Marini. Trained as an archaeologist, he's made himself into an art historian. He is, I hope I'm allowed to say this, in some degree unique in my experience, or near unique among Italian curators. In some senses behaving more like a British or American curator, in that he has worked tremendously hard to make friends with and work with dealers and collectors. People will know that there are quarters in Italy in which dealers, like Justin, are regarded as the spawn of Satan. But the expertise that dealers and obviously collectors have is tremendously profound. And Marino has appreciated this, and the Bargello collections have benefited enormously, frankly, from the friendships he has made and the admiration which many collectors, in Italy and beyond, have for him. He's a wonderful scholar. This catalogue of this very great collection is overdue. It is wonderful that it has had the support now to make it happen, and it will be an immensely important scholarly event.
Thank you for adding that.
Very good point.
Very much. And Alan, also earlier, Alan, thank you for stressing the influence too that the Bargello has had on, in particular, the DIA, but also, as we all know, it's had influence on many others as well in America. So thank you too for that.
I couldn't have written and organized our 2-volume catalog of Italian sculpture without studying the Bargello sculpture collections very intently over many, many years.
Wonderful. Well,
thank you, Katherine, for organizing this and for being the heart and soul of the Friends of the Bargello.
Thank you, Katherine. Great to see everybody, by the way. Hope I can travel to England someday in the future, soon.
Good. Well, we look forward to seeing you. Thank you all. And we will follow up, if not on the London Art Week platform, then on the Friends of the Bargello. We'll follow up on another Maiolica talk, possibly near to the publication of the catalog. I mean, we at least need one more, I think. So,
as the late Vera Lynn said, we'll meet again.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much, all of you. Really, thank you for participating. Okay.
It's been a pleasure.
Bye.
Thank you all. It's been a great pleasure.